Hey everybody, this is Albert, and recently I've made a number of videos, and also in the past, dealing with the whole Acts 12:4 issue in King James onlyism, and most of these have actually been in response to other people's videos, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about this issue, and what I want to do here is, since I don't know if I'd like to go into detail with it, particularly for those who are new to the whole King James only issue or just curious, because this is a very popular one that's brought up, and I wanted to make clear, particularly since I've done a number of videos on this recently, exactly what my position is on this, because it's different, I think, than what you will likely get on both sides. So I want to be very specific and clarify everything here. Now, what we're dealing with in Acts 12:4 is the Greek word Pascha, and there's really no doubt what it is, what it means. It's the Greek transliteration of the Hebrew Pesach, what we would call Passover. In fact, Pascha is where we get the expression Paschal Lamb. There's no doubt what this means. Now, the problem is that the King James Version translates what obviously to us would be Passover as Easter, which obviously has an entirely different connotation. So what's going on here? Well, those who oppose King James onlyism, I think, sometimes will jump to extremes and say the King James translators made a mistake. I mean, a really big mistake, a boneheaded mistake. And it's kind of odd, I mean, considering, they did translate this word Passover everywhere else in the New Testament except here. So what happens, though, is that King James only is, of course, since they simply can't concede that anything in the King James Version is less than perfect. There had to be some reason, some deep reason for why this was translated Easter. So they come up with one. It's rather elaborate. Basically, what they claim is that the word there, Pascha, refers to the pagan day, a pagan holiday, and that's what the translators were referring to here. It's a pagan day that's being celebrated. Herod's celebrating a pagan day in this passage, and as evidence for this, well, first of all, the word Easter they just claim is a pagan day. It's a pagan name anyway. Well, you start out there. That's a pagan day, but then they go on to point out that if you look at the passages in the Torah about the Passover, what you have is the Passover being referred to for the day of preparation, followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the period that follows, the week that follows after that. But it starts out with the Passover is the day of preparation. So since that had already occurred when Peter was arrested, and they said they were going to hold him until the Passover was finished, and that part had already occurred, well, then obviously they can't be talking about the Passover. So that, the Jewish Passover, so they must be referred, because they were already in the days of unleavened bread, so they must be referring to some pagan day. Well, this fails at any number of issues. It just fails, let me detail exactly why. First of all, that word Pascha is never used anywhere to refer to a pagan day. It just isn't. All the pagan holidays all had perfectly good Greek names. They didn't need to borrow this one. It just fails. The Greek certainly has nothing akin to Easter, so that argument fails. But then you have this idea that the King James translators used it because they knew Easter was a pagan day. Well, no, the King James translators used Easter for the Feast of the Resurrection. In fact, you look at the Book in Common Prayer, this is something they worship. They celebrated Easter. They called it Easter. Look at Lancelot Andrews, the head of the King James Committee, has sermons where he refers to Easter as the day of the resurrection as Easter all the time. He didn't hold that idea. Furthermore, that day, what they're referring to is the pagan day. There was a pagan day, Iostra, among the Anglo-Saxons, which I doubt Herod had come into any contact with them, considering at that point they were probably somewhere in Germany, or perhaps even in the Caucasus or something, who knows, but it's not something he would have been familiar with. The way Easter, by the way, was never the name of the Feast of the Resurrection by either the Orthodox or Catholic Church. They always call it Pascha. The term Easter is only common among English and German people. In Germany, it's Oster, and in England, it's Easter. It comes from actually a month, the Ostermonth, which was an Anglo-Saxon month, which Easter would normally fall in. It basically gets translated over time. It develops from Ostermonth to Easter month. So that's where the name Easter comes from. It was never used by the Catholic Church. It was never used by the Orthodox Church, except in the vernacular in certain countries like England and Germany. So that gets shot down. But what about this whole idea of the Passover being the day of preparation? Well, that's true early in the Old Testament, but later it starts to become applied to the entire period. It's just in similar the way that certain holiday seasons, traditionally, for example, in England, you had Christmas Day, then you had the 12 days, the whole 12-day period between Christmas and Epiphany, referred to as Christmas, the 12 days of Christmas. That's where it comes from. So it's the same thing here. It starts getting applied to the whole period, and you can see this. And this is important. The writer of Acts was Luke. So look in Luke 22:1, the Gospel of Luke 22:1. He in the King James Version even refers to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is, of course, the period after the day of preparation. He says, which is called the Passover. Okay, so obviously it's referring to the whole period. So that idea just gets shot down. It simply, at the time of Jesus, Passover referred to the whole period, including the day of preparation and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and not just the day of preparation. Now, some people have tried to argue, oh, well, since it's the first day, they're only talking about that first feast. That's another argument I've heard. That fails too, because you see that first feast occurs after sundown, which puts it in the next day, because Jewish days go sundown to sundown. So that argument fails too. So why did the King James translators render it Easter? And why don't I think it's necessarily incorrect? Well, you see, just as Pascha had become used for both the Feast of the Resurrection, the Christian feast, and the Jewish feast in Greek, Easter had come to be used for both the Jewish feast and the Feast of the Resurrection among the common English-speaking people. It became used for both. In fact, if you look, what's interesting, you look at Tyndale's translation of the New Testament. He used Easter a lot of times King James only point out he used Easter in this passage, but they don't point out he used Easter in a lot of other passages too that are obviously referring to Passover. And so that argument fails. But what happened was when Tyndale did the Old Testament, he realized, wait a minute, we should make a differentiation. And he introduced the term Passover, but it sort of slowly gained acceptance. And what really probably happened, what ended up probably happening is when the King James translators went to their work, and different people, they were in like different groups who handled different parts of the scriptures, and then they brought everything together, and there was probably at some point, some of these, just like in other translations, sometimes they use Passover, sometimes they use Easter, and the King James translators at some point probably decided to make it uniformly Passover. But back then they didn't have word processors where you could just search for all occurrences of a word and replace it. And they probably just missed one. It's really, to their credit, in a sense, the success of the King James Version in the succeeding centuries made Passover become not only the most dominant term, but the only term to be used for the Jewish feast, and Easter became restricted to the Christian one. So now it's anachronistically, it looks like it's an error. At the time, it was acceptable, but probably they would have, if they had picked it up, they probably would have changed that one too. But you see, so in essence, a King James onlyist could actually have an excuse, could actually has a legitimate reason. Look, at the time, it was perfectly acceptable translation for that holiday. But because it's done as Passover everywhere else, it makes it look as though, well, maybe they missed one here, and it makes the whole process of the King James translation something, well, human, and they can't have that, and that's basically why they come up with this wild idea about pagan holidays and all that stuff, which simply fails. Thank you very much for your time.